Well, time to do a little bit of work on this Winchester Centennial Model 76 in 4560 that I got from Cimarron Arms some time back and made a video on. There's some annoying things about it that I want to go ahead and take care of. This little button right here, that is powered by a spring. And when you lift this button, it also lifts this block up out of the way. This block just is a physical block. It blocks the trigger. So the spring that powers this from the factory is quite heavy. And most people doing any kind of an action job will weaken this. I didn't weaken it enough. I weakened it quite a bit. It's amazing how many pounds of pressure it still takes to depress it. I didn't weaken it quite enough. You know, the idea is that if your lever is not all the way closed, then your bolt won't be all the way closed, and if you try to fire it, it could fire slightly out of battery. So the idea was it cannot fire until the lever's closed, but it shouldn't require that many pounds of pressure. What often happens is I would close the lever, and then as soon as I relaxed my hand, it would pop down in there and interfere. So I'm going to have to lighten the spring that powers this up a little bit. That requires no investigation, but what I am going to look at, and hopefully if I can do something about, is even though I smoothed this up quite a bit, and I actually did smooth it up quite a bit, there's still a bit of a hitch in it. The initial is pretty smooth. It starts to get kind of stiff, and you think it's from springs not being quite light enough, but it really, a lot of it seems to be related to just friction. Getting this point right here, the resistance I'm feeling here is not resistance to the lifter wanting to lift, it's resistance to the final cocking of the hammer. It's almost like I hit a wall right there. You can actually hear it click. I don't know exactly why it does that, and I'm going to investigate that. It's still smoother than it was from the factory, but it's that little bit right there. So it's just getting the hammer back. It seems to encounter something right there, and I think I need to work on the hammer spring a little bit more. It's almost like a two-stage hammer spring. Easy to hear, and then it encounters resistance right there. So I'm going to have to look at that and see what that is. Gets to that point, and it's like it encounters a brick wall. There's a hitch right there. The actual lifting of the carrier block is about effortless. So it's really all about fighting this hammer. I'm going to break this down. I also want to work on the mortise in the frame because I'm tired of having to make sure that my rounds are completely pushed into the center of the carrier before the action will work. There should be a bevel cut into that frame mortise. Hopefully I'll be able to get good video shots of it once I get this thing apart. But hoping to work on that a little bit as well. This rifle shoots well. It handles better than it did when I got it, but I know that it has the potential to be a much slicker handling rifle than it is. Sometimes it's nice to helpful to break this open a little bit before you pull up on the links. But yeah, that's the links. That's the only thing. Of course, there's an identical one on the other side, mirror image, but this is the only thing that is holding the bolt forward. And that's why people consider the toggle link to be kind of a relatively weak action. You've got, a place for a pin there, a place for a pin here, and ideally these nice rounded ends of these links should be close fits into their seats on the bolt and on the frame, and so that the pins just allow them to pivot. The pins really shouldn't be taking up any of the recoil forces, but in too many of these they are. Of course, with better metallurgy, we can get away with that to a degree, but because you can see that's not a perfect fit. It's not like it's a lapped in fit, but this is holding up just fine. But it really is kind of an elegant action. I think it's neat. I just like watching it do its thing. But, this is the spring right here. I got a little bit too light. All its job is it rides over a cam notch. You can see it lift up when I drop the lever. So this was quite thick. The spring was, as received. I did a lot of careful filing and stoning on it. You can see it's quite thin now. The idea is to do it gradually so that the whole spring is working, not just a little piece of it. And you don't want to have any areas where you have stress risers. It did a pretty good job. It returns it. It could be a little heavier. So if we take these out, and we'll set them aside, and then we can drop this side plate off, and look, the toggle link just fell right out on that, fortunately. One of the reasons people do some action work on these is because if this spring is very stiff, oftentimes a little knob, a little area sticking off to the side that actually bears against that cam track, oftentimes that knob is kind of rough. And spring steel can be pretty hard. It's high carbon steel, so it'll really start chewing into the cam lobe. So a lot of people do work on these just as a matter of course, because if the parts aren't all hardened to the same degree, or the sizing's a little different, what you can have is, rather than the parts just wearing in and polishing each other, you can have one part just eating away at the other part. So these, the insides of these things can eat themselves up. And if you look over on this side, you can see the other spring. It's identical, well, mirror image. And its job is just to control the lifter arm. And that's only purpose of this spring is just to ride into and out of that notch and provide the necessary resistance and positivity of that. I'm satisfied with the work I did there and the work I did on these springs, both of them. So no need to work on those. It's just almost effortless. Is there some resistance? Yeah, a little bit, but not enough to affect things at all, particularly when the thing's shouldered. I just hate to lever a rifle and have the butt feel like it wants to come down off of your shoulder because of the resistance you encounter. And you can see that's not a lot of resistance. But as received, yes, this spring was quite a bit thicker, quite a bit stiffer, and just some careful filing and stoning was all that I had to do to weaken it sufficiently. When I got the bolt out and disassembled, there's a couple things I wanted to point out that Uberti's doing better than they used to, but still inauthentically, really. In the original Winchester, The firing pin extension portion and the firing pin itself were, I believe, all one unit. It was like this. And you did have a cam, a slot right here, somewhere on the firing pin extension portion. And you had an arm that communicated with that slot, and also communicated with the levers, the toggles rather, so that when you levered the rifle, as you started to drop the lever and the toggle started to move, one of the things this little cam lever did was it levered the firing pin back. So what that did was the firing pin was mechanically brought to the rear, because there was no return spring or anything like that in it. So once the hammer had struck the back of the firing pin extension and driven the whole firing pin forward and touched the round off, it was stuck in the forward position. So as you worked the lever, the little cam just cammed that back with it, and it made sure that during feeding, of course, with that cam like that, there was no way that the firing pin could be protruding out the front of the bolt to accidentally detonate a cartridge while you were working the lever really fast, because it was mechanically prevented from reaching it until you closed it all the way. Uberti and every other maker that I'm aware of, well, Chaparral made some reproductions that were completely authentic in this area. Unfortunately, they garnered such a bad reputation for poor quality everywhere else that their authenticity didn't ensure their survival in the replica market. But what Uberti did is they just adopted a separate firing pin with a firing pin return spring. So the firing pin goes down in there, and the firing pin extension just communicates with it by slamming into it. But because it's spring loaded, that's it. It uses a spring to retract. What Uberti used to do was they had a pin that held the firing pin extension to the back of the bolt, and that pin would sometimes break. So what they've done now is sort of a nod to the authenticity, but with still using a firing pin return spring, which many people feel is actually superior. They just use a key, kind of similar to the old camming arm, except it's very short. It's just a key, and that key just pops up in there. It's held there by the same pin that holds a toggle in place, and now the two are separate, are attached. And that can move a very little bit, just enough so that when the hammer strikes the back of that, it'll knock the firing pin forward enough to set the round off, and then the spring returns it to the back position. So some people are unaware of that, thought it was kind of interesting. And if you also take a look at the bolt, you can see another reason why the toggle link design is not as strong as other designs. This is really a rather narrow bolt. And this bolt is not really supported at its forward end. When it's loaded, when it's shoving around into the chamber, it's just hanging there. You got this whole long length of bolt. There's nothing supporting it from the bottom really, other than this very little teeny tiny tab here, which is really more of a feeding helper than anything. It just helps put this position, the round to be firmly gripped by the extractor. If this wasn't here and you started to extract the round and it got so far back, the pressure of the extractor could actually shove the rim down, and then the extractor would just slip off the rim. So that's really all that does. It just supports the rim once it's loaded in there. Some of the chaparrals were missing this altogether, or it was broken off, and these can break off of the bolts. And if they do, you have to take it to a good gunsmith. Either buy another bolt or take it to a good gunsmith who can weld that back up and recut it. But this is a rather narrow bolt. It's not even as big around as the cartridge. And it's just hanging there in space. supported at the rear by the toggles, but that's a lot of flex that can occur. And you can understand why these would not withstand a tremendous amount of bolt thrust. They withstood what they needed to withstand, and they served in that capacity quite well. But that's one of the other reasons you don't hot rod these things. All right, let's see if I can illustrate the area that I'm talking about when I've talked about machining a bevel into the mortise of the frame. A mortise just being usually a square-shaped cut, and this would be the mortise cut through the frame. And on the back of the mortise cut, the back wall of it, if your round is cockeyed in the carrier, which usually your last round is going to be rather cockeyed in the carrier, what you want it to be able to do is still the carrier rise and the rim strike a beveled area right here. This little beveled area right here. Now, I beveled and polished that when I first got it, but evidently I was not quite aggressive enough with the bevel. So I'm going to hit that again and polish it up just a little bit more, and that should solve my problem. I shouldn't have to be sticking my finger way down into the carrier block and trying to seat the round over. So we'll see. Whether I end up posting this on YouTube or not, at least this video will be helpful to me. About a half hour's work with files and stones to try to deepen this bevel a little bit. I think I've accomplished what I set out to do. You don't want to overdo it, so fortunately I won't really know until I get it back together and try to cycle some rounds through it. Here's something that in some ways defies explanation. This is the hammer face, and the problem with the Italian way of case hardening is it's not particularly deep, but the underlying steels are shouldn't be quite as soft as what was originally. But you see this line right here? That's actually a divot, and it's really caused by firing. The hammer striking the firing pin extension. What's odd to me is I noticed a line there before when I first got it, and it's definitely still there, but it seems to have gotten deeper. This doesn't, can hear that? This doesn't slide up there that cleanly. I don't know how many times this rifle was cycled before I got it, and I'm sure I'd cycled it dry a few times before I worked on it, but very soon after I got this I started working on it, and you can see the back of this firing pin extension where it rides over the hammer. I mean, that's one of the things I did to try to smooth the action. That is a mirror polish, and this edge is broken very nicely. I'm going to carefully try to stone some of this. A little worried I'm going to take the case hardening off. I hope I don't, but I think if I do, the answer is going to be, well, I probably needed a new hammer anyway, considering the damage that was already here. Obviously, the face was soft enough to be deformed by striking this, and it also almost suggests that, when this strikes the firing pin extension has been pushed to the rear slightly by the firing pin spring. So when this is striking this, it's not flying forward and smacking it head on. This is pushed out slightly by the spring. So I'm guessing this, when it actually strikes it, it isn't quite hitting it square on. It's actually smacking it right there at a bit of an angle. So a remedy might even be to shorten the firing pin extension a little. I just don't know by how much. Probably, yeah, the solution might be to have taken a little bit of metal off of the firing pin extension so that even pushed out by the spring, when the hammer strikes it, it won't be striking it at any kind of an angle. It'll be striking it you know, face on. That's nothing I've read about in any literature, but in my opinion, that's some pretty significant damage to the hammer face, and it's not abuse. That's probably just misfitment. Alright, I made the decision to go ahead and stone the hammer face, even though I risk stoning all the way through the whatever hardening it has, but obviously it wasn't hard enough as it was. It's hard to tell, but that is quite a dimple. And I've been stoning on it for a while, so the color case hardening that the Italians put on is just a very, very, very thin skin. It's really just for cosmetics. It's a cyanide process. But yeah, pretty deep. So, and I have also shortened slightly the rear of the firing pin extension and polished it back up to a mirror polish. Increased that bevel slightly. So I'm hoping that even if I have slightly worn through the case hardening, that it will strike the firing pin more square than it did before. There won't be as much concentrated pressure on this one little area. But that firing pin extension proved to be very, very, very hard. Very much resisted file, so I'm not sure the hammer was ever up to snuff. Well, it took a bit of stoning, but I finally got that big divot stoned away. I just hope Uberti uses a good grade of steel in their hammers, because I would have to have stoned through any case hardening if there was any significant case hardening. So let's hope they used a good grade of steel. I know they've got good grades of steel because this firing pin was exceptionally hard. But let's hope that this smacking on the firing pin doesn't destroy the hammer. But I should probably know within a few dry fires if it does. And because of that divot, I didn't feel like this hammer was long for this world anyway, so maybe order another hammer somewhere down the road. Hopefully won't have to. And this is the spring I finished grinding on. Well, filing on and polishing. It's nice if you can put a good mirror polish in a spring. That's why springs crack typically, is because they've got a scrape or a line somewhere that creates a stress riser. And that's why springs tend to crack. Don't you hate to do a bunch of work on something only to discover it probably wasn't necessary? Before, when I was caulking this, there was a hitch about halfway, and I could not figure out why I was having that hitch. And it seemed like the seemed like the mainspring, as I'd cock it, first this portion of the mainspring would strike the frame, and then the top portion would bend. And I thought, well, I probably didn't do the best job grinding it, and it's still too stiff in the top portion, and this portion's actually bending more easily. So this part's bending all the way till it touches the frame, and then the top part is, and that's the hitch I'm feeling. So reground it, probably made it a good deal lighter than it ought to be. We'll see if it smacks the primers. Put it back together, still having an issue. It's still, you know, it was go get to about there, and then there would be some sort of interference, and it would finally go to full cock. What is the problem? Somebody, and it wasn't me, had to be Uberti, installed this piece in backward. You would think that the worst you'd have to worry about is shoddy finishing of parts, or not having parts polished all the way, maybe not even adjusted all the way. You shouldn't have to worry about a part being assembled completely incorrectly. But here's what I'm talking about. This little thing right here on the hammer, I don't know what that's called, this little link, stirrup or something, but that's what actually the spring engages. The spring has these little fingers, and they engage in that. That allows the hammer, as it moves back, it allows the nose of the spring to pivot a little bit on it. Allows it to be very smooth. It gives it a nice full range of travel while it pivots around there. This entire stirrup piece was installed backward. You notice it has a curve to it. It was installed completely backward, so the curve was running this way. Never would have thought to look, never would have thought to notice that. But as it sits now, it's allowed to rotate till it just about touches the back of the hammer. But as originally manufactured at Uberti, it was installed backward, so it tended to stop right about there. You know, it's curved back this way. Well, if you install it so it's curved the opposite direction, the back part of the curve bottoms out in this cut too early, and it stopped right about there. And that was the two-stage cocking I was getting. It was stopping right there, and when the hammer wanted to cock further, after it stopped, the only way the hammer could continue back was if this little stirrup jumped up over these ears, up to there. So the hitch I was feeling was these little ears on the stirrup jumping the ears on the spring, like that. All I had to do was knock the pin out, switch it around the other way, and now it just cocks as smoothly as you would want. So probably all the work that I did on the spring was not only unnecessary, it's probably going to be detrimental. No hitch whatsoever. That was probably my issue all along. It's just something that I just never noticed. Wouldn't think to notice. So I hope I have enough power to actually pop a primer. Should cycle awfully smooth. There's the hammer. Nice polish. But I hope it's hard enough to withstand smacking the firing pin. I'd say I may be ordering a new hammer. Well, a little concerned. I think I ended up in regrinding, refiling, repolishing the mainspring to solve a problem that wasn't the mainsprings after all. It ended up being that incorrectly installed stirrup. It's probably too light. That just, if it'll actually set off a primer, I'll be really happy. It just doesn't feel like it's got much oomph behind that hammer. And maybe ordering a new mainspring, because that is just, it's positive enough. Pretty slow lock time too. Boy, if it does. And if the hammer face doesn't end up peening up from use, indicating a soft hammer. Boy, if it actually does set off a primer, I mean, that is one smooth, easy. I mean, there is nothing to work. No hitches on it anywhere. Well, we'll see. Finish getting back together and it'll pop a primer. Well, are we going to need another mainspring? Probably. Pretty confident of that. So confident that I'm not even using ear protection for this. But primed empty case. This actually goes off. I'm going to be awful happy. Well, I'm a little deaf. I'm also pretty happy.